on YouTube? My name is Tech and welcome back to another video on the channel. In today's video, we'll be looking at a AIO versus a regular heatsink cooler, and this is going to be just comparing the two and seeing which one is going to be better for your money and your worth. Anyway, let's get straight into it. No bullshit, we're just going straight into it. So right here we have a stock AMD heatsink. This is one that you may find in a box of a AMD CPU cooler or as an Intel one. These are very cheap CPU cooler fans that you'll find on any CPU box or inside the CPU box. These are usually good for using out of the box settings such as stock overclock of 3.6 gigahertz of a Ryzen 3600. Now how heatsinks work is that there are dense fins like this you see right here. These are dense fin stacks, and what this does is it makes contact with the die with thermal paste. Thermal paste is the application to adhere to the CPU die. So as for GPUs as well, GPU dies are not as even cut as most people think. Even if robots cut them, they're still pretty uneven, which means that thermal paste is there to fill in any of the sort of roughness or unevenness of a GPU die or a CPU die. So as a CPU, it has a lid over the die itself, or a heat spreader, and we also put this on the cooler or the CPU. Now what a heatsink does is it gets the heat that is generated from the CPU from all the voltages and all the overclocks that you may have on it or not, that is generated through the gigahertz clocks, and that heat gets dispersed through this heat. These dense heat fins are, these are fins, but there's also pipes, which will go on later in the video. And basically what this does is the heat rises. That's how chemistry works. Heat rises into the heat fins. This fan then spins it around or away from the CPU, allowing you to have a more efficient cooling for your CPU. If you had your CPU, let's say, going without a cooler, that thing will run for around, I don't know, like 3-4 minutes before it shuts itself off completely, before it fries out. That's how CPUs are made, with that kind of parameter set to check to make sure that it does not burn itself out. Now when we go over to AIOs, which I'll show one right now, this is my very own AIO that I have in my system. It is the Corsair H100i Pro RGB-XT. It's a very good AIO. Now when it comes down to AIOs, there's kind of like two different things that you'll find. An AIO doesn't have any heat sinks, but the actual radiator, the radiator kind of acts like a air cooler's heat vents. So the water transfers the heat from the CPU into those fins, which then disperses that out into the environment where the fans are, to then move that hot air throughout the system. So as you can tell with the tubes bring the heat through into the radiator. As it passes through the radiator, goes out the fans, whichever configuration that you might have. Now, depending on the pump loop and your coolant, we're gonna go into the pros and cons of having an air cooler such as this, or a heat tower, which is also, I will explain that later, versus an AIO. Now when you have an air cooler, the pros that come with it is kind of it's pretty inexpensive most of the time, depending on which ones you're buying. There's the Hybrid T12 Evo, which is a very, very great heat tower. Why did I just say heat tower? Let's call it heat tower. I'm an air cooler, and this has a bunch of copper heat pipes. Now pretend that there were like pipes coming down that were made of copper, and there's also a plate which would then mount to the CPU, raising that up. And this is actually more efficient than this air cooler that we have here right now, because the copper heat pipes actually move the hot air or the heat from the CPU faster into a heat stack or fins, then is dispersed through the fans. Now if any of you guys know what a regular heatsink tower I'm talking about, you would know that the fans are always faced to where you push the heat into the exhaust of the system. That's how the heat tower or the tower works. An AIO uses some type of coolant or water solution. It's not really water, it's some type of coolant, and has a cold plate, which is basically this kind of copper plate that mounts to the CPU. And it works in a similar sense as removing the heat. Now, the pros of actually having AIO is clearance in the case. A lot of times, air tower coolers are very tall and they won't fit into certain cases, and most of the time you may have to make sure that you measure out your case correctly to buy a correct heat tower. Now, an AIO is very, very low profile. It's used in a lot of ITX form factor builds. It's very aesthetically pleasing as well, which is why a lot of $2,000 builds and above use them, because they're just very clean to look at. And it uses the radiators as well, which is very interesting, because instead of having the heat fins actually on top of the plate, it's actually into the front of the case, which is very nice to have. And honestly, it just makes a whole PC build look so much cleaner than if you had a heatsink. Now, depending on whether or not you want a AIO or a regular air cooler, depends on your situation. Let's say that you have a budget and you want to be under it. So you're saying, I have a Ryzen 5 3600 or maybe a anything below that. You may want to go with the air cooler unless you are upgrading down the line. But if you have a, let's say, a 3800X or 3900X or even the new Ryzen 5000 processors, you might want to go with, you will go with an AIO or something that is high caliber air cooler that will allow to cool the system down. Now, going to the cons of an AIO, we actually have quite a few with this. You have to worry about pump failure, which is something that is not common, but you still have to worry about because it is still something that happens to a lot of people. It happens to a lot of YouTubers as well. And the coolant, after 4 years of running constantly, evaporation does happen to the loop. It is a closed system loop of some type of coolant. And after a while, the coolant may kind of dip down. It doesn't mean that it won't work. It just means that there'd be less coolant in the loop, meaning you might have to refill it. And the actual good thing about some of the AIOs from manufacturers is they put a cap on it. So you can actually open the cap and fill it with the coolant that's correct for your AIO, which is nice. But at that point, you might as well just maybe buy an AIO. Another con with an AIO is that they are pretty expensive to get. Now, what I mean by expensive, they go up for $100. They come in 240mm, 360, and 120. And also, I believe they have 480mm radiators without the AIO pump. It's just the 4D rad. And honestly, it depends on how much you want to spend, because from years now, heat towers or heatsink towers have always been kind of behind in performance. But as the years have caught up, 4 or 5 years later, air coolers versus AIOs has been the main discussion of, they're so close to getting performance, do I really need an AIO? Whereas an air cooler can do the same job for a lower price. Now, there are amazing air coolers out there and also great AIOs. But when it comes down to performance, we can actually see that that air coolers are actually pretty close to AIOs in my opinion. I have an AIO in my system only because I'm going to be upgrading my CPU down the line to a Ryzen 9 3900X. And that's one of the reasons why I have this in my system right now. Now, if you're not going to be upgrading down the line, then you can definitely go with an air cooler. Now, some of the pros, the cons you might find from an air cooler like this one or a tower, a cooler, is the fact of maybe noise. But then again, this AIO is making quite a lot of noise as well. So both might have the similar amount of noise. But some air coolers might not just perform as well as an AIO. It depends on which one you buy, but usually you get a pretty good deal on most unless you buy a pretty cheap one. You don't have to worry about the fan breaking. It's always connected by a PWM fan header like this one right here. But you run into clearance problems and also RAM problems as well. What I mean by RAM clearance problems is that the heat sink on the cooler, like the fins, might actually hit the RAM, causing you not being able to place it correctly in the correct slot, which is such a bummer to have when you have your full system kitted out, like 4 sticks of RAM, and then you put your heatsink on and it basically interferes with the RAM and you have to take them out. And it's just like, I don't want that, right? So that's why AIOs have such a great use case in many scenarios, especially for ITX builds. But for normal around budget builds, around $1,500 under, a heatsink is very, very good. There's no problems with that whatsoever. You just gotta make sure you buy one that fits your needs and the clearance issues as well. Now, when we go to performance, we actually have numbers from Gamer Nexus. And as we look from Gamers Nexus right now, for CPU on a bench, this is a 1950X at 4 gigahertz and also 100% fan utilization at 1.35 voltages. We can see the average temp of the die and also the tens peak dies as well, and also on idle. Now, when we go to the average temp die, we can see the AIO, this is a TR4 socket, is hitting around 50.7 degrees Celsius. But as we go to the Noctua NHU14 TRX, it is hitting around 59 degrees Celsius. Now, that 9 degrees Celsius is not that big of a deal if you really think about it. Maybe you want a little more cooling performance, but this both are reasonable for what they provide, and especially for the money, as the Noctua heatsink is a lot cheaper than an AIO. And right here, we have a very popular AIO, NZXT Kraken X62, and also a Noctua NHU12, which also scores around the same, getting a 63 degrees Celsius for the NZXT Kraken X62, and the Noctua NHU12, 66 degrees Celsius. Now, when we look at both of these, only 3 degrees difference. 3 degrees difference, guys. That's all it is. Heatsinks have come so close to the point of AIOs that it's become the discussion of, man, for high-end systems, you could put a heatsink as your cooler, which is totally fine, but it depends on what your preferences are. Personally, if you don't care about aesthetics at all, then go with an air cooler, because it's definitely a lot cheaper than an AIO. There are some crazy AIOs. There is one from NZXT that has an LCD screen. It's crazy. But people will spend their money on that as well, because why not if you're going to go all out for a build, right? But if you want that more kind of aesthetically building, and also maybe you're building in a smaller form factor, an NZXT Kraken X62 is definitely going to be worth it, in my opinion, because of clearance issues and just overall sound and acoustics as well. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you leave a like and comment down any other ideas you have below. I wish I could do my own benchmarks, but at the moment I kind of don't have that supply at the moment. I have actually posted benchmarks of my own Corsair H100 XT cooling my Ryzen 5 3600. So go check out that video previously. It is very great. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure you leave a like and subscribe. Anyway, peace out, and I hope you enjoyed the video.